Chapter 1. Time and the Emerging Other. Apart from time, there is one other means to bring about important change. Force. If one works too slowly, the other will do it faster. Georg, Christoph, Lichtenberg. Of course, the history and prehistory of man take their proper places in the general scheme of knowledge. Of course, the doctrine of the world-long evolution of civilization is one which philosophic minds will take up with eager interest as a theme of abstract science. But beyond this, such research has its practical side, as a source of power destined to influence the course of modern ideas and actions. Edward Burnett, Tylor. Knowledge is power. That commonplace applies to anthropology as much as to any other field of knowledge, but commonplaces usually cover up for not-so-common truths. In this first chapter, I want to set down some of the terms for an argument to be pursued throughout these essays. Anthropology's claim to power originated at its roots. It belongs to its essence and is not a matter of accidental misuse. Nowhere is this more clearly visible, at least once we look for it, than in the uses of time anthropology makes when it strives to constitute its own object, the savage, the primitive, the other. It is by diagnosing anthropology's temporal discourse that one rediscovers the obvious, namely that there is no knowledge of the other which is not also a temporal, historical, a political act. Perhaps this covers too much ground. Political can mean anything from systematic oppression to anarchic mutual recognition. The epigrams chosen for this chapter are to indicate that our attention will mostly be directed to the oppressive uses of time. Anthropology's alliance with the forces of oppression is neither a simple or recent one, as some moralizing critics would have it, nor is it unequivocal. The brief sketches of some of the historical contexts in which anthropological uses of time developed have the main purpose of recounting a story whose conclusion is open-ended and contradictory. Anthropology may, during the period covered here, have succeeded in establishing itself as an academic discipline. It failed to come to a rest vis-à-vis a clearly defined other. From sacred to secular time. The philosophical traveler. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, time has been conceived as the medium of a sacred history. Time was thought, but more often celebrated, as a sequence of specific events that befall a chosen people. Much has been said about the linear character of that conception, as opposed to pagan, cyclical views of time as an éternel retour. Yet such spatial metaphors of temporal thought tend to obscure something that is of more immediate significance in an attempt to sketch the ancestry of time's anthropological uses. Faith in a covenant between divinity and one people, trust in divine providence as it unfolds in a history of salvation centered on one Savior, make for sacred conceptions of time. They stress the specificity of time, its realization in a given cultural ecology, the Eastern Mediterranean first, and the Circum-Mediterranean with Rome as its hub later. Decisive steps towards modernity, those that permitted the emergence of anthropological discourse, must be sought, not in the invention of a linear conception, but in a succession of attempts to secularize Judeo-Christian time by generalizing and universalizing it. Different degrees of universalizing time had, of course, been achieved in an abstract form by earlier philosophical thought. In fact, universal time was probably established concretely and politically in the Renaissance in response to both classical philosophy and to the cognitive challenges presented by the Age of Discoveries opening up in the wake of the Earth's circumnavigation. Nevertheless, there are good reasons to look for decisive developments, not in the moments of intellectual rupture achieved by Copernicus and Galileo, nor, for that matter, by Newton and Locke, but in the century that elaborated the devices of discourse we now recognize as the foundations of modern anthropology, the Age of Enlightenment. If we follow G. Gusdorf, we may locate the starting point of these developments, a sort of barrier that had to be broken through in one of the last attempts during the 17th century to write a universal history from the Christian viewpoint. Bossuet's Discours sur l'histoire universelle, first published in 1681. Perhaps it is too simplistic to put Bossuet at the other side of a pre-modern modern watershed, for in many ways he anticipated the Enlightenment genre of philosophical history. His opposition to modernity is not so much in the detail of his methodological prescriptions as it is in the position that integrates his views. Faith in the evangelical specificity of all of history as history of salvation. A brief reading of the introduction to the Discours, entitled The General Plan of this Work, will illuminate the importance of Bossuet's treatise. Bossuet's professed aim is to alleviate confusion caused by the multitude of historical fact. This is to be accomplished by teaching the reader to distinguish different times, temps, with the help of universal history, a device which is to the histories of every country and of every people what a general map is to particular maps. In this analogy, the universal is aligned with the general, which signals a certain ambiguity, one which, incidentally, is still with us in anthropology's quest for universals. Universals appears to have two connotations. One is that of totality. In this sense, universal designates the whole world at all times. The other is one of generality, that which is applicable to a large number of instances. The important point, borne out by the body of the Discours, is that Bossuet does not thematize the first connotation. His account does not cover the world, it never leaves the circum-Mediterranean. Writing within the horizon of the history of Christian religion, he does not see his perspective, nor does he look beyond his horizon. The former is self-evident as an article of faith, the latter is bounded by his political position at the French court of Louis XIV, whose succession to the Christian Roman Empire he takes for granted. Perspective and horizon of the Discours are tied together by the all-pervading intention to validate, albeit not uncritically, the political realities of his day by a history that is universal because it expresses the omnipresent signs of divine providence. In contrast, Bossuet is quite conscious of problems implicit in the second connotation of universal. How can one present history in terms of generally valid principles? He argues that such a project rests on the ability to discern in the sequence of things, suite des choses, the order of times. Methodologically, this calls for an abbreviation of sequences in such a way that order can be perceived at a glance. Comme d'un coup d'œil. A long history of the art of memory is behind this remark, and a history of the visual reduction of temporal sequence, its synchronic understanding, lies ahead of it. A methodological device that opens the view over time is the epoch, conceived not in its currently most common understanding of a period or interval of time, but in a transitive sense derived from its Greek root. An epoch is a point at which one stops the journey through time to consider, as from a place of rest, all that happened before or after, so that one may avoid anachronisms, that is, a kind of error which results in confusing the times. In exposing universal history, one proceeds by treating a small number of epochs in secular and religious history, the outcome of which will be, and here Bossuet's methodology rejoins his faith, to make visible the perpetual duration of religion and the causes of the great changes in the empires. Thus, both the external spatial boundaries of history and its inner continuity are of religion. Where a mere sequence might cause confusion, the distinction of times in the light of divine providence creates order. It demonstrates the omnipresent work of salvation. O. Ranum, the editor of a recent English version, reminds us that Bossuet used the term discourse in the title of his work deliberately. He wanted to break with conventions according to which highly stylized secular and religious histories were produced during the 17th century. Bossuet asserted his freedom to abbreviate, condense, and emphasize without being bound by the then firmly established canon of historical facts each historian was expected to report. In this, he anticipated the philosophical history which Voltaire opposed to mindless chronicling and out of which the first projects of modern anthropology were to grow. Less obvious, but equally important, is the model set by Bossuet for what one might call sermonizing history, which is another possible connotation of discourse. Bossuet wrote his work for the enlightenment and education of the Dauphin and his father, the Sun King. It was meant as a refutation of attacks on the literal understanding of the Bible and as a defense of a Gallican, French-centered Reformed Catholicism. In short, his distinction of times is embedded in concrete political moral concerns. He expressed himself through discursive devices that were rhetorical in the classical sense, aimed to move and convince the reader. His political intent and his rhetorical form were to influence the writing of the philosophe and to become part of anthropology's heritage as, in Tylor's words, a reformer's science. We set out to show in Bossuet's Discours an example for a pre-modern treatise on universal history. Now, we seem to end up with more similarities than dissimilarities if we compare his method and devices to those of the Enlightenment philosophical historics. We are confronting here a well-known problem in the interpretation of 18th century thought. On the whole, the philosophe, whom we recognize in many respects as our immediate ancestors, achieved only a sort of negative modernity. In the words of Karl Becker, their negations rather than their affirmations enable us to treat them as kindred spirits. Or, as Gusdorf puts it, these thinkers replaced Bossuet's Christian myth with the myth-history of reason, which, by and large, continued to use the conventions and devices of earlier periods. If one wants to show how time became secularized in the 18th century and onward, he must concentrate on the transformation of the message of universal history rather than on the elements of its code. The latter display a remarkable continuity with preceding periods down to the Greco-Roman canons of the arts of memory and rhetoric. The transformation of the message had to be operated on what we identified as the specificity of Christian universality. Change also had to occur on the level of political intent or judgment. It was on that level that the philosophe had to overcome Bossuet, who was never reluctant to judge all of the past in the light of the single most important event of all time, the brief passage of the man-God Jesus through a life on earth. In fact, among the many expressions of change one could cite is the very transformation of one man's all-significant passage on earth into the topos of travel. In the Christian tradition, the Saviour's and the saints' passages on earth had to be perceived as constituent events of a sacred history. To be sure, this had occasioned much travel to foreign parts in the form of pilgrimages, crusades, and missions. But for the established bourgeoisie of the 18th century, travel was to become, at least potentially, every man's source of philosophical secular knowledge. Religious travel had been to the centers of religion, or to the souls to be saved. Now, secular travel was from the centers of learning and power to places where a man was to find nothing but himself. As S. Moravia had shown in his brilliant studies, the idea and practice of travel as science, prepared in Diderot's encyclopedia, was definitively established toward the end of the 18th century, especially among the thinkers known as ideologues. Two names, those of J.M. Degérando and C.F. Volney, are of special interest in this connection of travel and the secularization of time. It was Degérando who expressed the temporalizing ethos of an emerging anthropology in this concise and programmatic formula. The philosophical traveler, sailing to the ends of the earth, is in fact traveling in time. He is exploring the past. Every step he makes is the passage of an age. In this statement, the attribute philosophical echoes the militant enthusiasm of the preceding century for a science of man to be conceived by man and for man, one in which religious and metaphysical searches for mankind's origin and destiny were to give place to a radically immanent vision of humanity at home in the entire world and at all times. Now, man is, in Moravia's words, placed without residue, inside of a world horizon which is his own. To travel means, in this framework, not only to quench the thirst for knowledge, It also signifies man's most intimate vocation. It is in this sense of a vehicle for the self-realization of man that the topos of travel signals achieved secularization of time. A new discourse is built on an enormous literature of travelogues, collections, and syntheses of travel accounts. The manifest preoccupation in this literature, in its popular forms as well as in its scientific uses, was with the description of movements and relations in space, geography, based primarily on visual observation of foreign places. However, this does not contradict the contention that elaborating a secular conception of time was its underlying concern. Precisely because secular time was its presupposition, logically speaking, or its signified, in semiotic parlance, the new discourse had, with exceptions to be mentioned later, no need to thematize time. Philosophical history, as is well known, was strangely ahistorical. Such distinction between intent and expression is an important principle of interpretation, which will be more fully elaborated in Chapter 3. It also invites a consideration of the reverse case. A discourse in which time is thematized may be about an atemporal referent. As we shall see, the 19th century evolutionism is a case in point. At any rate, philosophical travel, that is, the conception of travel as science, could leave the problem of time theoretically implicit, because travel itself, as witnessed by Degérando's statement, is instituted as a temporalizing practice. Why this should be so is explained by the subsumption of travel under the reigning paradigm of natural history. Moravia has shown that the project of scientific travel was consciously conceived to replace an earlier, enormously popular genre of mostly sentimental and aestheticizing tales of travel. The new traveler criticized the philosophe. The reality of lived experience and of things seen was now opposed to a reality distorted by preconceived ideas. One also begins to reject the link-up, unquestioned by earlier voyages, between travel in foreign parts and military conquest. According to Lapérouse, one of the most famous figures in this story, the modern navigators only have one objective when they describe the customs of new peoples: to complete the history of man. There is a significant double entendre in the verb to complete. As used by Lapérouse, it signifies belief in the fulfillment of human destiny. Travel is the self-realization of man. It also has a more literal methodological meaning, and might then be translated as filling out, as in to complete a questionnaire. In the episteme of natural history, the exercise of knowledge was projected as the filling of spaces or slots in a table, or the marking of points in a system of coordinates in which all possible knowledge could be placed. It is therefore not surprising that with the rise of an ethos of scientific travel, we also see the emergence of a genre of scientific preparation for travel quite different from the instruction European potentates used to give to the early navigators and conquistadors. We know its modern offspring, the notes and queries on anthropology which accompany generations of anthropologists to the field. Only recently have we rediscovered and come to appreciate such predecessors as Diderots' The Observation of Savage Peoples, issued from the short-lived activities of the Société des Observateurs de l'Homme. It is most revealing to find that a model of the genre was conceived by that natural historian par excellence, Linnaeus. This confirms, if confirmation is needed, beyond any doubt, the roots of the new science of travel in natural historical projects of observation, collection and classification, and description. The new travelers did not mindlessly subscribe to empiricism and pure positive description. Volney, one of the most eminent representatives of the genre, is also the one who advocated a critical stance based, and in this he is closer to the Romantic revolt against the Enlightenment, on explicitly historical, i.e. temporal considerations. During his voyages in Egypt and Syria, he constantly had to face the dilapidated monuments of a once glorious past. Contrasting past and present became an intellectual concern as well as a literary device pervading his writings. It was elevated to a poetic philosophical vision in his Les Rois ou Méditations sur les révolutions des empires. Better than any commentary, the opening page from Ruines will illustrate the poignancy of contradictory experiences of past and present and the political nature of Volney's concern with time. In the 11th year of the reign of Abdul Hamid, son of Ahmed, Emperor of the Turks, at a time when the victorious Russians took the Crimea and planted their banners on the coast that leads to Constantinople, I was travelling in the empire of the Ottomans, and I traversed the provinces which once had been the kingdoms of Egypt and Syria. Carrying with me my attentiveness to everything that concerns the well-being of man in society, I entered the cities and studied the customs of their inhabitants. I ventured into the palaces and observed the conduct of those who govern. I lost myself in the countryside and examined the conditions of those who work the land. Seeing everywhere nothing but pillage and devastation, nothing but tyranny and misery, my heart was heavy with sadness and indignation. Every day I found on my road abandoned fields, deserted villages, and cities in ruins. Often I encountered ancient monuments and temples reduced to debris, palaces and fortresses, columns, aqueducts, tombs. This spectacle turned my spirit to meditating about times past, and it caused in my heart thoughts that were grave and profound. When he later draws the lessons from times past for times present, thus the title of chapter 12, he finds consolation in a thought that rings with the optimism of the philosophe. It is a man's folly that makes him lose himself. It is up to man's wisdom to save him. The peoples are ignorant. May they instruct themselves. Their rulers are perverted. Let them correct and better themselves, because that is the dictate of nature. Since the evils of societies come from cupidity and ignorance, mankind will not cease to be tormented until it becomes enlightened and wise, until they practice the art of justice, based on the knowledge of their relations and of the laws of their organization. The difference between this new faith in reason and Bossuet's old faith in salvation could not be expressed more clearly. Bossuet preached understanding of a past that contained a history of salvation and divine providence. Volney preaches, too, but has no recourse from the history of man. To him, knowledge of the past is a sort of Archimedean point from which to change an otherwise hopeless present. There certainly is an element of romantic pessimism and nostalgia in his reveries on the orients of glorious past. At the same time, if we consider the context and message of Ruines in its entirety, we find, beneath the image of a dream which the writer conveys to his readers, the pragmatic assertion that it is his, the educated French traveller's, knowledge of the past that counts. It is a superior knowledge, for it is not shared by the Orientals caught in the present of their cities, either deserted and dilapidating, or overpopulated and putrid. Bossuet had evoked the same topos at the end of his discours, albeit with a different conclusion. Egypt, once so wise, stumbles along drunken, dizzy, because the Lord has spread giddiness in its designs. She no longer knows what she is doing. She is lost. But people should not fool themselves. When it pleases him, God will straighten out those who err. Prefigured in the Christian tradition, but crucially transformed in the Age of Enlightenment, the idea of a knowledge of time which is a superior knowledge has become an integral part of anthropology's intellectual equipment. We recognize it in an outlook that has become characteristic of our discipline through most of its active periods. the posited authenticity of a past, savage, tribal, peasant, serves to denounce an inauthentic present, the uprooted, évolué, acculturated. Urban anthropology, inasmuch as it exposes counter-images to the pristine wholeness of primitive life, was, in an obvious sense, the byproduct of an advanced stage of colonization abroad and an advanced stage of urban decay at home. On a deeper level, as Volney's example reminds us, it was the point of departure for our discipline, in that it expressed the consciousness and concerns of its urban bourgeois founders.